best podcast, the Heidelcast.
Calvin never actually taught weekly communion. That's just false. And so I hope that if you heard that claim and were persuaded by it, you'll change your mind, because here we have actually Calvin claiming or arguing, insisting on more than weekly communion. This would be, we followed this the way he says, communion every time we meet.
The opinions expressed in this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the views of this station, its management, or its advertisers. Listener discretion is advised. Ladies and gentlemen, the story you are about to hear is true. The names have been changed to protect the innocent. And now, Scott Clark.
Inconceivable!
Slap some bacon on a biscuit and let's go! We're burning daylight!
Missed it by that much.
I don't know about that. We're just getting started. It's the Heidelcast, the podcast devoted to recovering Reformed theology, piety, and practice.
We talking about practice. Not a game. We talking about practice.
I'm a pastor and a church historian. This episode is for the week beginning Sunday, September 7th, 2025. We're brought to you by the Heidelberg Reformation Association. We exist to recover the Reformed confession and to help others discover it. We are at heidelbergrefformationassociation.org. Email or send a voice memo to heidelcast@heidelblog.net.
At the tone, leave your name and message. I'll get back to you.
Call or text the Heidel phone anytime at 760-618-1563. That's 760-618-1563.
Apple Podcast comments.
Don't forget to subscribe in Apple Podcasts or in any podcast app and give us a 5-star rating in your app so that others can find the Heidelcast. And we're now on YouTube at Heidelcast. And don't forget to check out the Heidel shop at heidelblog.net/SHOP.
Guess what? I got a fever, and the only prescription is more cowbell.
Oh, thank you for the cowbell. We really need more cowbell.
This is part 16 of our series,
To nourish and sustain.
We've compiled a resource page at heidelblog.net/nourish for the series. It has a bibliography, a list of Heidelblog resources, and all the episodes for the series.
The best podcast, the Heidelcast.
Last week we looked at what happens when unbelievers partake of the Lord's Supper, and we considered what Calvin says about the superstitious abuse of the supper and the question of what it means to be a worthy participant in the supper. This week we're considering Calvin's argument for frequent communion, among other things. And we are at 41744. So book 4, chapter 17, section 44 of the 1559 edition of Calvin's Institutes, and I'm using the Battles edition if you're reading along. And this is the last section, I guess, or the last part of Calvin's discussion of the Lord's Supper in the Institutes. Calvin writes, "What we've said so far of the sacrament abundantly shows that it was not ordained to be received only once a year, and that, too, perfunctorily, as now is the usual custom. Rather," he wrote, "it was ordained to be frequently used among all Christians in order that they might frequently return in memory to Christ's passion by such remembrance to sustain and strengthen their faith and urge themselves to sing thanksgiving to God and proclaim his goodness. Finally, by it, to nourish mutual love and among themselves give witness to this love and discern its bond in the unity of Christ's body. For as often as we partake of the symbol of the Lord's body as a token given and received, we reciprocally bind ourselves to all the duties of love in order that none of us may permit anything that can harm our brother or overlook anything that can help him where necessity demands and ability suffices." Luke relates in the Acts that this was the practice of the apostolic church when he says that believers, quoting here, continued in the apostles' teaching and fellowship, in the breaking of bread and prayers. That's obviously Acts 2:42. Calvin writes, "Thus it became the unvarying rule," now listen to this, "that no meeting of the church should take place without the word, prayers, partaking of the supper, and almsgiving." And when he says almsgiving, he's talking about what we typically today, at least in the North American Presbyterian and Reformed Council world, the NAPARC world, and this would be true for the British churches in which I worshiped and probably other churches. But almsgiving refers to the diaconal offering. So this wasn't an offering for the support of the ministry of the church because, of course, these were state-established churches and were funded that way. So these were, what as I say, diaconal offerings. So I think that's worth bearing in mind. And in fact, it wasn't taken, I don't think, during the service. I think it was placed in a box after the service. But listen to this sentence again. No meeting of the church should take place without the word, prayers, or taking of the supper and almsgiving. Some years ago, an old ministerial friend of mine who was fairly influential in his denomination at the time said, and apparently persuaded some people, that Calvin never actually taught weekly communion. That's just false. So I hope that if you came under the influence of this person or ever heard that claim and, were persuaded by it, you'll change your mind because here we have actually Calvin claiming or arguing, insisting on more than weekly communion. This would be, if we followed this the way he says, communion every time we meet. So certainly this would be communion twice every Sunday, if not more than that. There were other meetings. Now, whether he wanted communion administered on days other than the Lord's Day, I don't know. But certainly he wanted it administered every time we met on the Lord's Day. And he made that very, very clear, abundantly clear in a number of places. He complained explicitly that the practice of the Genevan Church was deficient. He actually arranged the liturgies so that it would sort of leave a hole at the end so that people would say, well, something's missing here. And they would, come to their senses and say, well, of course, we need to practice the Lord's Supper or administer the Lord's Supper in this sort of gap in the liturgy. It didn't work out that way. Calvin never got what he wanted in his own time. And frankly, I don't know if the Genevan civil authorities ever changed their mind, but certainly they did not do it during Calvin's lifetime. And I don't know whether they did it during Beza's leadership of the company of pastors. So Calvin goes on to say that this was the established order among the Corinthians. Also, we can safely infer from Paul, and he's referring to 1 Corinthians 11:20, and it remained in use for many centuries after. By the way, Calvin's exactly right about that. We'll come back and talk about that some more under a different heading, but the history is fairly clear. So the practice that many of us know, which is quarterly communion, and some maybe have 6 times a year, and one congregation in which I was, we had it 9 times a year, and of course I've been in congregations where we had it weekly too. But the ancient practice and the New Testament evidence is fairly clear, and the practice of the ancient post-apostolic churches is rather clear that they had communion every week.
Heidelcast. Ladies and gentlemen, Scott Clark.
Calvin wrote, hence arose those ancient canons. These are rules, 1 N, not 2, attributed by them to Anacletus and Calixtus, that after consecration is finished, all who do not wish to be outside the precincts of the church should partake. And in those old canons, those old rules, which they call apostolic, we read, and he quotes, those who do not stay until the end and do not receive the sacred communion should be corrected as disturbers of the church, close quote. And he goes on, in the Council of Antioch also, it was decreed that those who enter the church and hear the scriptures and abstain from communion should be removed from the church until they correct this fault. Although this was softened, or at least set forth in milder language, at the First Council of Toledo, which met in 400, Calvin doesn't tell us that, but I looked it up, and he continues, still it was also decreed there that those who, having heard the sermon, have been found never to communicate are to be warned. Communicate means to come to the Lord's table. If, after warning, they still abstain, they are to be excluded. Now we're at 417:45. Calvin writes, obviously by these constitutions, holy men meant to retain and protect the frequent practice of communion, received, as it was, from the apostles themselves. For they saw that it was most wholesome for believers, but that it gradually fell into disuse out of common neglect. Augustine testifies of his own day, and Calvin quotes, "The sacrament of this thing, namely of the unity of the Lord's body, is set upon the Lord's table and received from that table daily in some places, in other places at certain intervals, by some men to life, by others to destruction." Close quote. He continues. And in the first letter to Januarius, Augustine says, quoting again, "Some partake daily of the Lord's body and blood, others receive them on certain days in some places. No day passes when it is not offered. Elsewhere, only on Saturday and Sunday. Still elsewhere, only on Sunday." And again, close quote. But since, as we have said, the common folk sometimes become more lax, this is Calvin, holy men sharply rebuked them to avoid seeming to wink at such indifference. There is an example of this in Chrysostom's homilies on the letter to the Ephesians, and he quotes Chrysostom. "It is not said to him who dishonored the banquet, 'Why did you recline at table?' but 'Why did you come in?'" And that's an allusion to Matthew 22:12. "Whoever does not partake of the mysteries is wicked and shameless to be present there. I beg of you, if anyone invited comes to a banquet, washes his hands, reclines at table, and seems to get ready to eat, and then tastes nothing, does he not dishonor both the banquet and the host? So, when you stand among those who prepare themselves with prayer to receive the most holy food, in the fact that you have not withdrawn, you have confessed that you are one of their number. But at the end, you do not partake. Would it not be better for you not to have been present? I am unworthy, you say. Therefore, you were also not worthy of the communion of prayer, which is the preparation for the receiving of the sacred mystery." Now we're at 11746 in Calvin's Institutes. And Calvin continues, "Plainly, this custom which enjoins us to take communion once a year is a veritable invention of the devil, whoever was instrumental in introducing it. They say that Zephyrinus was the author of this decree, although it is not believable that it was in the form in which we now have it. Or perhaps, by his ordinance, he did not provide too badly for the church, as times were then. For there is not the least doubt that the Sacred Supper was in that era set before the believers every time they met together, and there is no doubt that a majority of them took communion. But since all scarcely ever happened to take communion at once, and since it was necessary for those who were mingled with profane and idolatrous men to attest their faith by some outward sign, the holy man, for the sake of order and polity, appointed that day on which all Christian people should, by partaking of the Lord's Supper, make a confession of faith. Posterity wickedly distorted Zephyrinus' otherwise good ordinance when a definite law was made to have communion once a year. By this it has come about that almost all, when they have taken communion once, as though they have beautifully done their duty for the rest of the year, go about unconcerned. It should have been done far differently. The Lord's table should have been spread at least once a week for the assembly of Christians. Again, here it is, in case anyone doubts that Calvin was advocating for weekly communion. It's all over this chapter and also in his short treatise. So it was something that he always taught. Anyway, Calvin continues, "And the promises declared in it should feed us spiritually. None is indeed to be forcibly compelled, but all are to be urged and aroused. Also, the inertia of indolent people is to be rebuked. All, like hungry men, should flock to such a bounteous repast." It's just a feast. "Not unjustly, then, did I complain at the outset that this custom was thrust in by the devil's artifice, which, in prescribing one day a year, renders men slothful all the rest of the year. Indeed, we see that already in Chrysostom's day, this degrading abuse had crept in, but we can see at the same time how much it displeased him. For in the passages which I just quoted, he sadly complains of great inequality in this matter. At some times of the year they often did not come even when they were clean, but came at Easter even when they were unclean. Then he exclaims, O O presumption! In vain is a daily offering made. In vain we stand before the altar. There is no one who will partake along with us. Close quote again, that's Chrysostom. So far is Chrysostom from having approved this by lending it his authority. And now we're down to 417-47 through 50 of Calvin's Institutes. And he's talking about the withdrawal of the cup from the laity, from the people. He says, out of the same shop came another regulation, which has either stolen or snatched half the supper from the greater part of God's people. The symbol of the blood, which denied to lay and profane persons. A lay person is an unordained person, somebody who doesn't hold special office in the church. And profane can be generic or it can be pejorative. I take it here he's using it in a pejorative sense. These are titles they apply, Calvin writes, to God's inheritance. And then there's an allusion apparently to 1 Peter 5:3. Was given as a special property to a few shaven and anointed men. And when he says shaven, he means priest, as they called themselves, who had the tonsure, the top of their head, shaved as the part of their office, either as a monk or as a priest, but typically, maybe both, but certainly I think for a priest. Calvin continues, the edict of the eternal God is that all should drink. It's an allusion there to Matthew 26:27. Man dares supersede and abrogate it by a new and opposing law, decreeing that not all should drink, and that such lawgivers may not irrationally contend against their God. They pretend perils that could occur if this sacred cup were commonly offered to all, as if those perils had not been foreseen and considered by God's eternal wisdom. If I can interrupt here, this is a really important point. So not only is Calvin arguing for weekly communion, but he's also arguing against serious misunderstandings about the nature of the supper. And so these are two of the reasons I wanted to do this series. One, because I think widely spread in the Napark world and probably beyond is this notion that the supper is a funeral and not a feast, or a test and not a feast. And so I'm trying to persuade you, and I hope to do some more with this in the episodes that follow this one, that in Scripture and in ancient Christian history, the supper is regarded as a feast. In other words, it's gospel and not law. It has consequences, that's true, but it's not bad news, it's good news. It's not do this and live, it's Christ has done. Christ is doing, Christ is giving, Christ is feeding. It's Christ coming to us. It's Christ lifting us up to himself. It's Christ feeding us on himself. And I really believe that if we grasp that, or if that truth grasped us, perhaps more to the point, that it would change our opinion about the supper and our attitude about the supper. Again, I think one of the reasons why people are so reluctant to come to the table, and I think one of the reasons people became so reluctant to come to the table in the late patristic period and through the Middle Ages was that the supper had been turned into a law. And so people instinctively reacted to that. And so by turning it into a law, by making it sort of the culmination of a test or a series of tests, and by attaching to it all sorts of obligations, people began to recoil against it. They didn't want, in a sense, instinctively more law, yet another law, because you have to understand that very early in the post-apostolic church, in order to refute the Gnostics and the Valentinians, the Christians began to talk about the Bible as if the whole thing were law. Talked about the Old Testament as the old law, and they talked about the New Testament as new law. Now, you can find people in the ancient church clearly teaching and preaching and explaining the gospel. I'm not saying that is gone or absent, but that the stage is being set. The preconditions are being established for turning Christianity fundamentally into a legal religion. This is why I think people began postponing their baptism, right? Or parents postponed the baptism of their children because it came to be seen as just another obligation or a gateway to additional obligations. And so it became a law and not the gospel made visible. Properly understood, the holy sacraments, baptism and the Lord's Supper, are not law. They are gospel. They are good news. They are announcements of what Christ has done, They are promises of what Christ is doing, will do, shall do, and so forth. And so if we think of them that way, then we receive them joyfully. And we accept the consequent obligations with joy because we're not being placed into a covenant of works. But if you see baptism as the entrance to a covenant of works, which essentially says do this and live, for example, cooperate with grace sufficiently or else, to put it in the medieval context, that would be true whether one is thinking of baptism in the medieval church or the Lord's Supper. And both were sort of gateways to a kind of covenant of works. And I think people recoiled against that. So then people, as Calvin is complaining about here, set up all these conditions that had to be met in order even to participate in the Lord's Supper. And as he's complaining about here, the church began to restrict the cup from the laity because they had changed the nature of the cup. Again, it's not only no longer gospel, but now it's not even wine anymore. Under transubstantiation, it comes to be thought of as the literal blood of Christ, and the bread being transubstantiated, allegedly, right, putatively, comes to be considered the literal body of Christ. And then you can see all kinds of mischief follows from that. So that's what Calvin's talking about here. So he says, then indeed they subtly reason that one is enough for two. And here he's paraphrasing, for if it is the body, they say, it is the whole Christ, who cannot be separated from his body. Therefore the body, by concomitance, contains the blood also. Well, that's a paraphrase of the argument that they're making. See how much our human thought, Calvin wrote, is in agreement with God when, with slackened reins, it begins to go even a little wanton and wild. The Lord shows us bread and says that it is his body. He shows us the cup and calls it his blood. The boldness of man's reason cries out to the contrary, that bread is blood, wine is body, as if the Lord had, for no reason, distinguished his body from his blood by both words and signs. And it had ever been heard said that the body of Christ, or the blood, is called God and man. Obviously, if he'd meant to signify his whole self, he could have said, it is I, as he is accustomed to speak in the scriptures, and Calvin gives several passages, but not, this is my body, this is my blood. But intending to help the weakness of our faith, he ordained the cup separately from the bread in order to teach us that he suffices for drink no less than for food. Suppose now that one part is taken away, then we shall find only one half the nourishment in him. Therefore, though what they pretend should be true, that by concomitance, when you get the one, you get the other, that's what he means, the blood is in the bread, and again, the body is in the cup. Still, they defraud pious souls of the confirmation of faith which Christ gives us as something necessary. Therefore, bidding farewell to their quibbles, we must hold fast to the benefit that, with double pledge, we receive from the ordinance of Christ. And again, I want to interject here and explain a little bit. This is really important, and it's, I think, again, important for us in the NAPARC world and perhaps others out there. For example, and we're going to come to this, there's a movement that has gained ground and is surprisingly popular in some circles. I've only seen it in PCA churches, but I assume it's elsewhere. And that is the practice of intinction. Now, this isn't exactly denying the cup, but it is, I think, fair to say it's a half step to denying the cup. And it has some of the same problems with the medieval church, the Roman church, at least as long as they did. I think they restored the cup in Vatican II in the early 1960s, 1964, something like that. But for centuries and centuries, the Roman Church denied the cup to the laity, and they made up reasons why it was a good thing to do. And I think Calvin's argument against denying the cup also holds for intinction, right? What did Christ institute? He instituted bread and wine. Well, if you're practicing or administering the supper using intinction, it's true, people are getting bread and wine, but they're not actually getting the cup, you see. Well, they're getting bread and wine, but they're not getting the cup. And they're not getting the cup because somebody thought, well, I know that this is what Christ did, and I know this is what the church has always done, but we're going to do it this way because, and frankly, the reasoning that I've heard is really, I don't know what other word to use, shocking. It's purely pragmatic. It's to save time, which is a terrible reason to take a half step, to be polite and to be accurate about this, I guess, withdrawing the cup that Christ instituted and he gave to his people. If I told my children, I want you to put these tools here and here, and I need you to do it just that way for certain reasons. Maybe I didn't explain all the reasons, but I know why they need to be that way, and I expect them to do it. That's what's good for them. That's what's safe for them. That's what is of benefit for them, right? Well, then if they don't do it, they put themselves at risk, and perhaps they put other people at risk, putting the tools in the wrong place in the wrong way, or maybe just leaving them out, and maybe somebody gets hurt on a tool or something like that. You see, well, the Lord knows what he's doing. He knows why he gave us bread and wine, because that's what's best for us. Well, anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. We're going to come back to that, and we're going to talk about that when we finish this section of Calvin. We'll start on some of this stuff next week. But I just want you to think about how relevant what Calvin is saying here about the Roman practice of withdrawing the cup, how relevant that is to us in the Napark world when we do similar things, maybe not identical things, for some of the very same reasons. If we do similar things for the same reasons as the medieval church, how are we not going to have a similar outcome?
You know how crazy Clark is about Nebraska football? Well, I finally decided to check it out for myself. Man, woman, and child, this is amazing. 90,000 screaming fans dressed in red. Though, as an outsider, I must say that I am a little dubious about Herbie Husker. And what is this Runza thing that everyone wants me to eat? I just don't know. What I do know is that after the game, when the band is gone and all the fans are gone, the HRA will still be here, recovering the Reformed Confession and helping others to discover it. Help us help you by making the coffer clink or send a tax-deductible donation to the Heidelberg Reformation Association, 1637 East Valley Parkway, number 391, Escondido, California, 92027. Oh, and one more thing. Go Big Red. Call or text now, 760-618-1563.
We're in section 48 of Calvin's Institutes, where he wrote, I know indeed that the ministers of Satan, as it is their custom to mock the scriptures, quibble over this. First, they claim that from a simple act, one ought not to derive a rule which the church is bound to observe always. But they lie when they say that this is a simple act. For Christ not only proffered the cup, offered it, we would say, but ordained that the apostles should do so thereafter. For these are the words of him who commands, drink ye all from this cup, Matthew 26:27. And Paul recalls it to be such an act that he commends it as a fixed ordinance, 1 Corinthians 11:25. Another evasion is that only the apostles, whom he had already chosen and enrolled in the order of sacrificers, and he has that in quotation marks, were admitted by Christ to participate in the supper. But I should like them to answer me 5 questions, from which they cannot escape without easily being refuted with their lies. First, what oracle has revealed this solution to them, so foreign to God's word? Scripture lists 12 who reclined with Jesus. You can see that in Matthew 26:20. But it does not so obscure Christ's dignity as to call them sacrificers. We shall afterward deal with this term in its proper place, Calvin adds. Even though he gave it to the 12, he still bade them to do the same, namely distribute it among themselves. Secondly, why, from that better age, even to 1,000 years after the apostles, did all, without exception, partake of both symbols? Did the ancient church not know whom Christ had admitted as guests to his supper? it would be the most abandoned shamelessness to halt here or to dodge the question. There are extant church histories, there are books of ancient writers which give clear evidence of this fact. The flesh, says Tertullian, and now we're in the very early 3rd century, and he is quoting Tertullian here, is fed with the body and blood of Christ, that the soul may be nourished of God, close quote. How, he's quoting here, says Ambrose to Theodosius, quoting, will you with such hands receive the sacred body of the Lord? How will you make bold to partake of the cup of his precious blood with your lips? Close quote. Jerome mentions the priests who perform the Eucharist and distribute the Lord's blood to the people. Chrysostom says, quoting here, not as in the old law, the priest ate part, the people part, but one body and one cup are offered to all. Those things which pertain to the Eucharist are common to priest and people. Augustine, in numerous passages, attests the same. If I can interject here, there's just no question that Calvin is right about this. The ancient Christian practice was for believers to receive cup and bread. And Rome is pretty open about this most of the time in their official documents. And they say, well, we know that Jesus instituted bread and wine. And I'll paraphrase here. What she says is, but we are the church and he gave us authority to make these kinds of changes. And so we are doing this. We're making changes to the sacraments. For example, in this case, adding the 5 ecclesiastical sacraments or withholding the cup, right? She does this on the basis of her alleged authority, divinely given authority, while pretty openly admitting what Jesus instituted. And then here Calvin makes a very good case for the fact that this was the ancient Christian practice. And so he says in 41749, but why do I argue over a thing so well known? Let all the Greek and Latin writers be read, and such evidence will be found in abundance. And this custom did not fall into disuse while one drop of integrity remained in the church. Gregory, whom you can rightly call the last bishop of Rome, taught that the custom was kept in his time, and he quotes, but the blood of the Lamb is, you have now learned, not by hearing, but by drinking. And again, quoting, his blood is poured into the mouths of believers, close quote. Indeed, 400 years after his death, after Gregory's death, this is Calvin, when all things had already degenerated, so think of Gregory dying in the 7th century, so we're in the 10th or 11th century, Calvin says, it still endured. So 1,000 years after Christ's death, the people were still receiving in their hands the cup, right? So they were communing, as the discussion came to be termed, in 2 species or in 2 kinds. Calvin writes, and it was considered not merely a custom, but an inviolable law. Truly, a reverence for the divine institution then flourished, and they did not doubt that it was sacrilege to separate what had been joined by the Lord. So speaks Gelasius, quoting here. We have found that some, receiving only the portion of the sacred body, refrain from the cup. Doubtless, since they seem to be bound by some sort of superstition, they are either to receive the sacraments entire or to be entirely barred from them. Close quote. For this mystery cannot be divided without great sacrilege. Men heeded those reasons of Cyprian, which, of course, ought to move a Christian mind. How, he says, quoting Cyprian here, do we teach or call upon them to shed their blood in confession of Christ if we deny Christ's blood to those about to fight? Or how do we make them fit for the cup of martyrdom if we do not first in the church, by the rite of communion, admit them to drink the cup of the Lord? That the canonists restrict that decree of Gelasius to the priests is too childish a quibble to require refutation. Thirdly, why did Christ simply say of the bread that they should eat, but of the cup that they should all drink? And see, for example, Mark 14, 22 and 23, Matthew 26 and 27. It is as if he deliberately intended to oppose Satan's craftiness. Fourthly, if the Lord, as they would have it, honored only, quote, sacrificers in his supper, what man would ever have dared to call strangers who have been excluded by the Lord to partake of it, and even to partake of that gift whose power was not in their possession without the command of him who alone could give it. Indeed, with what assurance do they today presume to distribute to the common folk the symbol of Christ's body if they have neither command nor example of the Lord? In other words, they can't say, well, Jesus only intended that the priests should receive, right, the cup. Of course, there's no basis for that, but just grant that for the moment. They can't turn around and then distribute it to the people when the way that they've construed the original institution prohibits the people from receiving any of it. In other words, they can't have it both ways. They're just making things up, and Calvin's calling them out on their inconsistency. Fifthly, was Paul lying when he said to the Corinthians that he had received from the Lord what he delivered to them? 1 Corinthians 11:23. For afterwards he declares the thing delivered to be that all indiscriminately, in the church of course, should partake of both symbols. 1 Corinthians 11:26. If Paul had received from the Lord the practice that all be admitted without distinction, let those who drive away almost all God's people see from whom they have received their practice, since they cannot now pretend that its author is God, with whom there is no yes and no. That's an allusion to 2 Corinthians 1:19. And still, they dare cloak such abominations with the name of church and defend them on that pretext. It is as if these antichrists, who so readily trample, scatter, and abolish the teaching and ordinances of Christ, were the church, or the apostolic church, in which religion flourished in full vigor, were not the church. Well, that's the end of Calvin's treatment of the supper in the 1559 Institutes. In the coming episodes, we're going to do 4 things. Next time, we will make a quick survey. I'll just spend one episode on it. A quick survey of Base's clear and simple treatise on the Lord's Supper. We're blessed to have an English translation appear in the last 10 years or so. David Noe did that. It's published by Reformation Heritage Books if you want to get that and read along. Theodore Base's clear and simple treatise on the Lord's Supper. And then in a following episode, we'll go through intinction. I don't know whether we'll spend a whole episode. Maybe we'll see. Lane Keister has written a really wonderful essay on intinction, and I'm just going to walk through that essay with you. You can find that on the Mid-America Journal of Theology site. And we also have a PDF of that on the Heidelblog, and we'll link that to that episode. And then following episode, this would be the third, I guess, following this series, and we'll talk about pedo communion or infant communion. That will probably take a whole episode. I don't want to do more than one episode because, frankly, it's I don't know what else to say, kind of a silly argument, but it needs to be done because there are a lot of people who don't understand why the Reformed churches give baptism to infants, but not communion to infants. And then there is a movement. The Federal Visionists have been pushing pedo communion for a number of years. And I have been in churches where parents just took it upon themselves when communion is distributed to give it to their children because they don't understand why we don't commune infants in the Reformed churches, and we don't do it for good reason. Because the sign and seal of initiation into the visible covenant community is one thing, and the sign and seal of renewal is another. We'll come back to that. And then we'll close out the whole series with an episode or so on weekly communion. So stay tuned.
The story you have just heard was true. Only the names were changed to protect the innocent.
That's it for this episode of the Heidelcast. Join us next time as we continue our series
To nourish and sustain.
Don't miss an episode. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts or in any podcast app, or find us on YouTube at Heidelcast. Don't forget to check out the Heidel Shop at heidelblog.net/SHOP. Email heidelcast@heidelblog.net. Call or text the Heidel phone anytime at 760-618-1563. That's 760-618-1563. Or send a voice memo to heidelcast@heidelblog.net. Remember, the Heidelcast may be cheap, but it isn't free. When the coin in the coffer clinks, the cost of bandwidth shrinks.
Copyright 2025. All rights reserved. This is a Heidel Media production.
This is the way.
All right, that's it. Let's roll. Hey.
Let's be careful.
Good night, Jeff.
Nothing is over until we decide it is.
Silence! I kill you!
I'm out of here!
We're a little late. Good night, folks.
Well, Gracie, say good night.
Good night.
Good night, Mrs. Calabash. We're heavy.
Ladies and gentlemen, Elvis has left the building.
It's the end of the program. Roy Knapp is at the chimes. Good night, all. We'll be with you tomorrow.
Tune in tomorrow. Same bat time, same bat channel.
Adjusting the Wayback Machine, Sherman and I were quickly on our way.
Ladies, an old-fashioned shortening made of gasoline and lampblack can give off deadly carbon monoxide fumes if you use it in your cooking. Why not protect you and your loved ones by switching to Grime, the magic shortening that spreads like lard? Try some soon, and be sure to join us next time when Edna goes to the village in the gathering dusk. Doesn't that breeze feel good?
Feels good. Cooler temperatures tomorrow and much lower humidity. A high only in the low 80s. Right now, the temperature here in New York is 83 degrees. The humidity 61%. The THI is 77.
Okay, now over at the mighty WOR studio organ, ready to play?
I'm ready.
Is Webley L. Webster. Terrific. That was
pretty good, though.
Really great. And
that was a delightful change of pace from the music you've been playing, slow and easy.
You know what that applause in the middle of it was?
What?
It was when you winked at the audience.
Oh, that is an applause aggregator.
Oh, that'll get them every time,
Yeah.
whether you're playing an accordion or a violin. I remember Florian Zabak used to get the biggest round of applause in the middle of the number with a wink.
Yeah, it is. But I didn't do it on purpose. It was something in my eye.
It was after you hiccuped there.
Yeah.
I think.
And some dust came up. Carmine didn't get in back of the music stand particularly. It's a little dusty back there.
Well, he'll take it.
And as I said, Dory, that organ played some notes I'd never heard before.
That was very good. That was the George Wright version of Boogie as performed on the organ.
All right.
Webley Webster.
Thank you. From the Bob and Ray Hit Parade, here's a good one. Glenn Miller, Pennsylvania 65000. Fun of memories to me in the audience.
Right, I'm going to be over with you folks in the audience.
I used to be over at the Cafe Rouge in Hotel Pennsylvania.
Hotel Pennsylvania, right?
Yes, sir. All the other big bands. Boy, those were the days.
Oh, yeah. I want to talk to you because you sound like you have a wealth of memories.
I'm with a flood of memories.
Well, here's something that'll remind you of something.
Sure.
Where's that old-timer in the audience that said he had so many great memories of things?
Yeah, I'm right here.
Well, now, you remember Pennsylvania 65000. You remember the song. You remember the hotel. Of course,
the Cafe Rouge,
sure. The Cafe Rouge.
They don't call it the Hotel Pennsylvania anymore.
No, they don't.
Something else.
I don't get over that way very often, to be frank with you, but I can't remember.
The Hilton, I think.
Anyway, what else do you remember about New York?
Well, let me see.
Remember the open trolley cars on Lexington Avenue?
Sure, and
in the summertime.
Double-decker buses on Fifth Avenue, and
I think it'd be a good idea.
Brooklyn Dodgers and the New York Giants, and the Brooklyn Yanks in football, or New York Yanks. The Boston Yanks and the Albany Yanks.
Gene Shepard the other night didn't remember the Boston Bees. Heard him talk.
Kidding.
1939.
Well, he's just a kid, huh?
Well, I guess he must be. Wally Ballou is going to bring back the double-decker buses, because it would cut down on traffic into and out of the city, and I think that's a great idea.
How do you mean it would cut down on traffic? I'm all for them coming back, but I don't figure how it works.
Well, with 2 decks, you got 2 layers of people, right?
No, the buses they have now carry more people than those double-deckers.
Oh, is that so?
Sure.
Well, I think they'd make bigger double-deckers.
The point is that you can't have a double-decker. It has to be a nickel fare, so you can put a nickel in that thing the fella has in his hand. So you can't get 35 cents for a ride on those double-deckers.
Oh, that's the reason.
Right.
That's the reason. Let's move over here to play our little game of see who has what in the audience. Does anybody have a monkey wrench with them?
I do.
I'm stopping now.
The best podcast, the
Dialcast.